Tonight, we won't open dusty chronicles to list inventions or royal decrees. Instead, we'll walk into a city where the air itself was a punishment, where your very first breath of the morning carried coal dust, soot, and the sour echo of factory chimneys. Here daylight was not golden but gray, and every shadow seemed stitched with smoke. Some said London's fog was thick enough to erase faces, to turn a neighbor into a stranger at arm's length. Others swore you could taste the empire's hunger in the grime that settled on windowsills, on bread loaves, even on eyelashes. Life was measured not in hours of sunlight, but in how quickly collars blackened and lungs gave way. So lower the lights. Let the weight of that soot-stained air press gently against your chest. And if your breathing begins to fall into the slow rhythm of the city's endless chimneys, don't be surprised. That's just Victorian London moving through you. If quiet descents into places like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next street lamp in London will be waiting for you there. And now let's take that first step into the morning itself, when the fog hasn't lifted, when the chimneys are already awake, and when your very first breath in Victorian London tells you exactly what kind of day it will be. It arrived in pea-soup fog so thick that a cab horse could lose its own nose in them. And on clearer mornings, the city produced an even humbler gift. A quiet drift of soot you could brush from your windowsill like black snow that never melted. It was fashionable to complain about it in letters. People measured distances by the time it took their collars to turn gray. If you are still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to more of these comforting details. But honestly, do not strain yourself. The city's coal fires will do the heavy lifting. They will lift every speck of dust and lay it gently on your eyelashes. You rise in a rented room the size of a wardrobe, which is appropriate because wardrobes were often rented rooms. The sash window groans. The glass is decorated with the delicate geometry of condensation that learned its shapes from last night's breath. You rub a circle clear and watch the street below rehearse its day. A knocker upper strolls past an alarm clock with legs, tapping windows with a long cane to wake people for work. It is a job you can do with nothing more than good lungs and the ability to remember faces. In another century, this would be called push notifications, but here it is, a woman with a bamboo pole and a professional talent for punctuality. Somewhere a muffin man sings, and the song carries better than the muffins. Farther along, a coal delivery leaves a small mountain of black candy at a cellar grate, and a cat sits beside it, looking pleased with modern industry. You consider washing. Everyone considered washing. The water looks perfectly innocent, the way a sleeping fox looks like a scarf. It has traveled through wooden pipes that creak like ship timbers and across a river that contains everything a city politely pretends not to remember. Engineers are arguing about where the intake should be above the sewage outfalls, below the sewage outfalls, or in an alternative universe entirely. Most people simply boil what they can and dilute what they cannot. Tea becomes a health measure with a social alibi. Breakfast is modest, a chunk of bread, a pat of something that thinks highly of itself and calls itself dripping. Perhaps a ladle of hot pea soup from a street vendor whose pot has been loyal to several generations. There's also eel pie if you like eels, and eel pie if you do not like eels but respect tradition. Londoners ate with enthusiasm equal to their carbon intake. Your first steps outside are less like walking and more like participating in a slow geological process. The flagstones are a tactile essay on the theme of recent weather. If it has rained, the city is glazed. If not, the dust achieves a fragile truce with the air and waits to ambush boots. The gutters, those adventurous little rivers, conduct experiments in open-air drainage. Around the corner, the day's first horse passes by, and you are reminded that the horsepower of Victorian London was, in fact, horses. The city accommodated something like hundreds of thousands of them, each with opinions about digestive scheduling. Crossing sweepers, usually children with brooms, keep little islands of swept pavement at the edges of streets, so that respectable shoes can pretend the rest of the road is a rumor. They work for tips. It is a delicate economy in which cleanliness is presented as a premium experience. By now, the narrow courts are awake. If you would like a small puzzle, please count how many households can fit inside one address. The answer is always more. The Rookery's neighborhoods, with the density of a well-packed trunk, were famous for being places where you could get lost, found, or both in a single afternoon. Here slang was a dialect of survival. Pickpockets, known as dips, practiced the gentle art of removing a gentleman's handkerchief as if performing a magic trick on the idea of ownership. A fogle hunter specialized in this exact task. And yes, the handkerchief is called a fogle because language takes one look at crowded cities and chooses mischief. The new Metropolitan Police, politely called peelers after the Home Secretary who founded them, persuade by presence as much as by power. Their tall hats are strong enough to stand on in order to peer over a wall. This is, handily, the world's first documented instance of wearable stepladders. Street food performs a slow parade in front of you. Baked potatoes breathe steam like small locomotives. Chestnuts massage their way toward readiness in pans with holes punched in them. The coffee stall man pours from a brass urn that has opinions about character. It is fashionable to complain that the coffee tastes of everything except coffee, but it is hot and sweet and comes with gossip in a spoon. A cat's meat man passes by, selling skewers of offcuts for pets with a budget. The air collects all these smells, coal, caramel, horse, humanity, and blends them into a perfume that does not exist anymore and is unlikely to return due to human progress and better choices. Even in the low light of a London morning, you can feel the city unspool like a long ribbon. Every few yards a new trade appears, a crossing sweeper with a bow, a match seller in a shawl, a costermonger balancing a theater's worth of oranges on a barrow that squeaks in the key of commerce. If you wish to survive the streets, you must move like tea, small determined currents, always looking for a clear channel. You keep one hand on your pocket, which is a charming habit even if there is nothing in your pocket. You learn to read traffic the way sailors read wind, gauging the thoughts of cabbies by the angle of their whips and the attention span of their horses. Rain turns the cobbles into long, slanting arguments about balance. The Thames is never far. It curves through the city like a big idea, important from a distance and complicated up close. Mudlarks comb its exposed banks for saleable treasure bottle glass. Nails, bits of rope and occupation that is simultaneously archaeology and chores. Overhead, the new iron railway bridges inspect the water like skeptical eyebrows. The fog approves of this and grows thicker. By midday, work has a voice that can be heard over the bells. Factories breathe out of tall chimneys. The soundscape is a portfolio of repeating motions, loom shuttles whispering across threads, press stamps kissing sheets of metal, boot heels editing the floor into chapters. If you have taken a position in a mill, your day is a conversation with the same few inches of cloth for 12 or 14 hours, timed by a clock with opinions about loyalty. If you are a match girl, you may be paid by the box and spend the day with yellow phosphorus that glows faintly in the dark and has the temperament of a jealous candle. If you are a child working as a half-timer, you attend school for part of the day and carry your sighs and your worry into the factory for the rest. There are inspectors, acts, and reforms, like a stack of blankets that grows thicker from decade to decade. The first blanket is thin. The later blankets are warmer. In between, many people shiver. Piecework is the city's quiet metronome. Garments move through 10 flats and 20 pairs of hands before they become a jacket you will never meet again. Waistcoat buttons are sewn on by someone who thinks of buttons as punctuation at the end of very long sentences. Taylor's basements smell of damp chalk and ambition. In the dockyards, Rope walks stretch like the world's most boring racetracks, and men pace back and forth, twisting strands so that ships can have something to hold on to. Farther inland, a compositor rearranges the alphabet into news and advertisements, while a clerk copies figures into ledgers so consistently that his handwriting begins to dream in neat rows. Lunchtime is bread and cheese, perhaps a pickled something, and a pint that calls itself liquid comfort but is actually just liquid. Because the water is uncertain, beer is a dietary habit, and a small sermon about boiled things. Productivity is measured in yards of thread and size per minute. The justice system waits in small rooms with big names. Bow Street, Clerkenwell, Marlborough. Each has a magistrate who has heard everything and is willing to hear it again. Petty crimes are the city's weather. A woman is charged with stealing a broom. A man is accused of borrowing a donkey with overly optimistic intentions. Reporters sit in the back and fill newspapers with tiny, perfect stories that read like a neighborhood gossip column compiled by a courthouse. Punishments are a taxonomy of discouragement. There is the treadwheel, which is a staircase that refuses to end. The crank, which is a handle that turns nothing and records how diligently it has been turned. And oakum picking, which is the gentle activity of pulling old ropes apart so they can be used to plug gaps in ships and in the human spirit. Transportation to Australia persists into the century as a philosophical experiment in geography. Debtor's prison fades later, although debt itself continues as a robust hobby. None of this is particularly cinematic. It is, however, very instructive about the many kinds of tiredness people can feel. Evening slopes in with the deliberation of a barmaid wiping a counter. Gas lamps fizzle to life one by one. The lamplighter's ladder taps against each post like a metronome setting the city as tempo for the night. You follow the glow into a gin palace, a kind of glass and gilt aquarium where the fish are people and the water is clear spirits. These establishments are brightly mirrored so that patrons can keep an eye on their hats and their lives at the same time. The bar is a sculpture of polished taps and civic optimism. The gin is sharp, botanical, and priced within reach of anyone with a coin and a story. Social critics call it mother's ruin. Social realists call it dinner plus conversation. In a corner, someone begins a song about a ship that never sinks and a sweetheart who does. The chorus knows itself by heart. On other streets, the music takes the form of music halls where comedians attempt to do for jokes what engineers are doing for bridges, make them bigger, louder, and visible from the cheap seats. Costermongers pack up their barrows. The wheels leave neat circles in the grime that look like diagrams of time. Lodging houses open their doors to the nightly migration of bodies, offering a bed if you have a few pennies, or, at poorer establishments, a rope to lean across if you do not. This is called a penny sit-up, which is both accurate and discouraging. The city has developed a vocabulary of proximity. Neighbors by night are not necessarily acquaintances by day. The underworld thickens where the light thins. There are brothels with red curtains and rules, and brothels with thin curtains and fewer rules. There are streets that promise romance and deliver economics. Just off the main thoroughfares, alleyways curl like punctuation marks and invite you to insert yourself. The police know which doors have a too busy threshold. The landlords know when to replace the hinges. Popular literature sells fear as easily as it sells pirates. Penny dreadfuls tell stories about criminals who are not necessarily dreadful but are always busy. And somewhere in the late 1880s, in the East End, rumors begin to gather like fog around a name that is not a name. It is better to let those rumors stand at the edge of the frame. They are not helpful for sleeping. Instead, notice the laundry hung between buildings like flags from a nation of damp linen. Notice the cat walking the top of a fence with the extreme professionalism of a tightrope artist who works for mice. Night carries its own weather. Disease prefers the crowded warmth of tenement rooms where 8 people share one bed in shifts that look suspiciously like schedules. Philanthropists visit with notebooks and the useful belief that statistics can be persuaded to behave. Doctors carry stethoscopes and a growing suspicion that germs are not just a metaphor. The city experiments with sanitation. Bazelget's new sewers march across maps like bold underlines, funneling things safely away so that London can flirt with the idea of breathing again. During the Great Stink of 1858, Parliament nearly relocated itself, which is an elegant way to cover one's nose. Later, the smell diminishes, and newspapers find other German words to admire. Progress arrives the way a well-meaning aunt does, with too much luggage and exactly the right hat. It is late now. Coal fires soften into embers that look like a meditation on the color red. A constable's footsteps pass beneath your window in a pattern you might trust with your secrets. He twirls his wooden rattle, more accustomed than a tactic, and checks the door handles of shops that sleep behind shutters. Down the street, a cabman drowses on his box while his horse does the professional thing and stands perfectly still. The city does not become quiet so much as it changes keys. A cart rattles once, twice, and then recalculates its route. Somewhere, an author scratches a sentence that will be quoted at dinner parties for the next 100 years, although right now, it is simply a person telling paper about fog. If you listen carefully, you can hear the slow heartbeat of pump engines pushing water, the softer exhalation of gas lamps consuming themselves, the distant metallic whisper of a printing press promising tomorrow's scandals about someone else. London in the 19th century is very much like a vast pair of bellows. Each day it inhales coal and chatter and work, and each night it exhales smoke and stories and the occasional foggy regret. People live their whole lives in one parish and become experts in a particular 3 blocks. They know which puddles are deeper, which policemen have kinder eyes, which shop will trade broken china for tea leaves. Their knowledge is intimate and not remotely portable. Outsiders, meanwhile, find themselves reading signs the wrong way up and inventing new relationships with their boots. In this soft hour, it is easier to notice the gentle absurdities. Men grow whiskers that appear to be auditioning for cartographic duty. Women build hairstyles so architecturally sound that pigeons look at them with professional respect. There are advertisements for tonics that promise to cure the human condition and probably taste like furniture polish. Newspapers debate whether train travel is a threat to moral fiber at 40 miles an hour. Somewhere, a housemaid scrubs a doorstep because clean stone makes a neighborhood feel possible. Somewhere, a clerk copies the same column of numbers thrice, because accounting is a religion with many rituals and at least one god of ink. Somewhere, a charwoman locks the door of an office she does not own and feels, briefly, like a trustee of civilization. When at last you lie down in a narrow bed that is almost a polite suggestion, you become aware of how much of the city has come home with you. Your hair contains the day's history in particulate form. Your boots remember every argument they won with the mud. Your pockets hold a newspaper cutting, a half button, and a virtue that might be thrift or might just be weight. The room is hardly larger than a sigh. The wall is thin enough to hear the next room's conversations with philosophy, a kettle, and the mysteries of income. On the mantel, a cheap clock ticks with the authority of Parliament. Somewhere beyond, a church bell edits the hour into something the city can live with. There is a small kindness in the thought that no one in this London expects perfection. They expect effort and a decent respect for cues. They expect you to carry your own packet of pins because buttons go on strike without notice. They expect you to know that Sunday is for washing, Monday is for drying, Tuesday is for ironing, and the other days are for improvisation. They expect you to step briskly in traffic, tip the crossing sweeper when convenient, watch your pocket, mind the step, and remember that life is improved by a cup of tea and the suspicion that you can afford another one. The city as a whole is a machine that turns steam and stubbornness into tomorrow. And so you wouldn't last a day in Victorian London. Not because the city is especially cruel, though it can be, but because it is extremely thorough. It would fill your lungs and your ears and your calendar. It would ask you to learn the names of all the sellers on your street, to recognize the hand of your laundress at 20 paces, to calculate the exact moment a fog becomes too honest. It would inquire politely if you prefer eel pie or the other eel pie. It would introduce you to the concept of a bed that is also a negotiation. It would provide reliably a daily parade of vegetables, vices, virtues, and very tidy policemen. It would invite you to notice tiny improvements, like the day the new drain finally works, and perhaps to applaud them in the privacy of your soul. We will leave the lamps burning low. The fog presses its soft face against the panes like an old cat. Somewhere a knocker-upper taps for tomorrow. The city settles into its coal-scented breathing. The clock loses interest in the precise minute and is satisfied with the general idea of time. If you are drifting now, that is sensible. London is still telling its long, repetitive story, the one about smog and alleyways and factories and shining glass bars about the smell of chestnuts and the squeak of barrow. Wheels about people who are very tired and very busy and sometimes very kind. It will repeat itself for as long as you need, quietly, patiently, until even the soot seems soft, and the streets become a blur of lamps on a river of sleep. You might not expect a book to begin with the sound of sand falling onto skin, but that is how morning starts in a medieval scriptorium. A small rain of pound-powdered chalk or cuttlefish, bone whispering over sheets of stretched calfskin to take away the last hint of grease. A page that has been patiently scraped, limed, and dried now receives this dust like a blessing. The sun, if it has time, slips through narrow windows and lays gold bars across desks that prefer to be called lecterns. Outside, bells sort the hour into thin slices. Inside, a monk adjusts his cowl and inspects his tools. The knife is for scraping mistakes, the stylus is for ruling, the quill cut from a goose who is now contributing to literature in absentia is for everything else. If you are still awake when we arrive at the recipe for red ink, involving ground cinnabar, vinegar, and a cautionary tale, you are welcome to subscribe. But truly, there is no rush. The letters will wait. They have been waiting since prime. The room keeps its own climate. Heat is suspicious in a place full of parchment, so the cold belongs to everyone, like the rule and the bread. They solve it with layers and with fingerless gloves that make the hands look like small, obedient animals. A cat performs a slow inspection of the benches, choosing the warmest body and the least important document for its nap. Parchment has two moods, the hair side and the flesh side, and scribes stroke it thoughtfully, deciding which mood suits Genesis and which suits the Psalms. Someone whispers a short prayer that is not for inspiration, which is a later luxury, but for steadiness. A quill must be cut often, and the penknife has a priestly patience. You can tell a careful scribe by the little drift of feathers at his feet, each a modest funeral for a nib that did its best. At the margins of mourning, wax tablets wait for rough notes, because you never draft directly onto a year of someone's patient calf. The day begins with lines. A sheet is pricked with a fine awl at the edges, and a stylus draws faint tracks between the pinholes, either with graphite's cousin, the lid point, or with pressure alone. Ruling is the promise that words will walk in straight rows and never wander off into a theological meadow. The lines are as soothing as a well-made bed. Scriptoria favored order in everything, including air. Even the dust motes seem to cue. In one corner, an inkhorn stands like a polite guest. The black is iron galls, copperas, gum, and perhaps a charitable splash of wine that pretends not to be wine. It goes onto the page, a friendly brown, and darkens like a thought that gradually becomes certain. On feast days, there might be azurite, or, if the abbey is wealthy or ambitious, lapis lazuli powdered into a blue that remembers Afghanistan, and the weight of mountains. But most days are the color of shadows and discipline. Writing is less like speaking and more like breathing with one finger. A scribe moves down the line with a rhythm that is not haste and not paralysis, a steady migration of letters that inherit shape and dignity from older letters. The script is a habit of the hand. Unshal, half unshal, Carolingian minuscule each is a house with familiar rooms. Some monasteries prefer tall letters that look as though they are praying. Others prefer rounded ones that look acquainted with bread. Spaces between words are a comparatively modern kindness championed by Irish monks who suspected, correctly, that readers enjoy not suffocating. Abbreviations multiply like small birds. A little line over a word means the rest of it is imaginary. A mark that looks like a 9 is actually con, which is very efficient if you know it and a perfect puzzle if you do not. The page receives these economies with perfect calm. It has seen worse. You can tell when a rubricator is approaching because his hands are red, politely. He gives birth to capitals, those blossoming initials that declare, in color, that something is starting. Sometimes the initial is architectural, an illuminated hallway you could stroll into with your finger. Sometimes it contains a man inside the letter N, looking surprised to find himself there. Gold leaf arrives as a rumor and is laid onto a glue of garlic juice or gum and fish glue called glare, which is the posh name for egg white that has chosen a second career. The gold resists exactly long enough to prove it is precious, then submits to a burnisher made from a dog's tooth that retired to a handle. In the corner, a boy grinds verdigris and remembers not to lick his fingers because history is filled with vivid greens and regrettable chemistry. Margins begin to bloom with quiet jokes. A knight fights a snail. A fish gives advice to a bishop. A monk complains in the first known comment thread that the parchment is hard today and the light is lazy. Silence has texture. It holds within it the little sounds that prove work is happening, the tick of quills reshaped against penknives, the almost private rustle as a sheet is turned, a cough held like a borrowed cup. Every hour or so a bell rings and the room stands up and the letters pause, patient as cattle in a field. The monks cross to the church, chant the hours, and return to their desks where the sentence continues as if it had been waiting in the air. One might imagine that copying is mindlessness, but it is actually attention with a leash. The eye jumps from exemplar to page and back like a small, trained animal, carrying a word in its mouth each time. Some scribes read in a murmur. Others read in the privacy of the skull, which was once considered unusual, and now is considered Tuesday. When a mistake happens, and it happens because bodies are involved, a razor's breadth of parchment is scraped, smoothed with pounce, and invited to forget. The page accepts this with the wisdom of materials. Midday arrives with bread and a bowl of something charitable. A novice with ink on his sleeve applies pumice to an oily spot like a very gentle argument. Another stretches a new skin on the frame. There is a polite economy to all this. The hair trimmed from hide becomes thread. The offcuts become parchment guards and bindings. The smallest scraps are bookmarks for chapters that want to be found again. In the cupboard, a small gourd of vinegar waits to thin any ink that has ambitions of becoming pudding. A good inkhorn lid is the difference between a faith and a tragedy. There is a story true enough to be repeated, that a cat walked across a fresh folio and left perfect paw prints next to a monk's short marginal prayer for better lids. Some call that vandalism. The manuscript calls it collaboration. The afternoon is the long river of doing. Choir sheaves of folded sheets are numbered with catchwords, little hints at the bottom of a page that whisper the first word of the next to help binders keep order later. The binder, an artist who believes in stitches over speeches, sits among presses, sewing frames, and glue that smells faintly of complicated soup. He will eventually clamp each choir and persuades the spine to become polite with wooden boards that have ambitions of eternity. He will add bosses and clasps so that the book closes like a resolved argument. Meanwhile, a corrector wanders the desks with the sort of kindness that notices everything. He finishes missing letters above the line in a small flying hand. He points a tiny finger shaped like a manicula at sentences that need remembering. In a world before sticky notes, a pointing hand is the next best thing to tapping someone on the shoulder. Illumination, when it comes, is a quiet wealth. Lapis is extravagance allowed in powdered form, a blue that carries deserts and donkeys across half the world to arrive under one hair-thin brush. Vermilion is brilliant and slightly scandalous because it remembers Mercury. Lead white is innocent until it remembers itself. In the palette shell, colors sit like well-behaved planets. The limner adds halos with a monastic attention that is part faith, part geometry. Sometimes he paints a field of tiny dots, the work equivalent of sipping water and thinking about the dignity of dots. Days move this way, letters, breath, brush. Letters, breath, brush. A visitor would call it repetition. A scribe calls it a psalm in slow motion. He knows how many columns fit his preferred page and how many words usually submit to a line. He can sense when the bottle of ink is about to tilt toward fate. His body becomes an instrument tuned to parchment. As the light begins to reconsider its employment, a different part of the book wakes up. The law written around the law, the library rules. Monastic shelves are not shelves so much as enclosures armaria, with doors that close as if the books were animals that might wander. Volumes are chained not because readers are criminals, but because books are the sort of citizens who forget to come home. Chains are generous. They allow reading at the lectern, while remembering the community is not a lending library for the merely impulsive. On the inside front leaf of certain volumes, a scribe writes a curse for any thief who mistakes piety for permission. These curses are mild as thunder. Some promise excommunication. One or two merely invite terrible itching. The binding creaks contentedly, like a door that recognizes your footsteps. Evening brings an inventory of fingers. Quills are blunted, cleaned, and laid to rest. The knife is wiped, the ruler straightened, the inkhorn capped. The day sheets are layered between boards to dry, and a weight, often a stone that remembers the river, sits patiently on top. The exemplar, the book being copied, is wrapped and returned to its shelf like a friend given back to his family after a holiday. In the refectory, supper items are announced by hand signs older than gossip. A fish is signed with 2 fingers swum through air. Cheese is signed by pretending to turn a tiny wheel. There's no sign for, I have been staring at the letter G for 3 hours and now all Gs look like sleeping cats. But everyone recognizes the face. Night prayers gather the community into a long, singing exhale. The chapel's darkness meets the note and makes something larger than breath. Afterward, the scriptorium is a different country. It smells of dust that has remembered its childhood. If someone must return for a forgotten tool, he carries a lantern and moves like a person visiting a sleeping animal. Here and there, a page waits pinned flat, shining slightly where the gold leaf asks for attention. You could listen for a scrap of conversation trapped under the glue, but glue is discreet. You could run a fingertip along a margin and feel where a line of lead has scored the page beneath the words, like a ghost of organization. You could read a single sentence out of context and feel its weight, which is both nothing and everything. The book that will result from these days is not a book so much as a companion with a spine. It will outlive its makers, which is not arrogance but mathematics. Skin and thread are very patient substances. In centuries to come, someone will scrape it again and write something new on top, creating a palimpsest where 2 texts share the same body like amicable roommates who leave notes to each other in the hallway. Scholars will later convince light to read beneath the top layer and discover a poem hiding under a sermon, or a legal complaint under a calendar of saints, and the library will pretend to be surprised. Meanwhile, parchment feels nothing but the ordinary dignity of enduring. Ordinary things, soap, shoes, bread know this feeling intimately. Books are merely joining the club. Humor walks softly in these rooms. A scribe might draw a small man blowing a trumpet from the tail of an S because the day needed music. Another scribbles a record of the weather. Cold, very cold, we had no fire. My fingers are a choir of small complaints. A third proposes that the margin is the natural habitat of a rabbit and proves it with ink. This is not rebellion. It is perspective. The text is the cathedral. The margins are where people picnic, quietly, without littering. If a drop of ink falls where it should not, it becomes a bird once you add a beak. If a letter leans, you write the next one leaning too and call it a style. Remedies for smudges are recorded with priestly calm. Sprinkle pounce, wait, brush gently, pretend it never happened. It is the same advice experts give for small embarrassments of the soul. A few times a year, visitors appear. A Lord Steward commissioning a gospel for a chapel. A scholar with a list of citations as long as an afternoon. A pious widow who wishes to endow a missal so that her name can attend Mass even when she does not. Negotiations proceed in a tone of polite arithmetic. How many leaves? What script? Will there be pictures? Would the patron like a depiction of himself looking modest near an important saint? Consensus asserts itself the way moss does quietly and everywhere. The steward leaves a purse that sounds heavy even when you are not shaking it, and the community carries on, its budget now a slightly different song. If you want to understand the pace of the scriptorium, watch the drying rack. A sheet finished in the morning sits higher by vespers, and the air is a collaborator that does not sign its work. Some pages wrinkle slightly as they accept pigment like a human brow considering an opinion. Others lie flat and smug. Books dry the way bread cools, internally with secret transformations that turn labor into something sliceable. A scribe knows, by pressing his palm very gently to a folio, whether the day's words are ready to be stacked or need an evening to think about their behavior. He knows how far to tilt a board so that gravity becomes a colleague rather than a boss. He knows that when winter comes, the ink will thicken and must be coaxed with warmth before it decides to be sociable again. Eventually, the day breathes itself out. The last glimmer in the window becomes a joke the window tells itself. The room blurs into silhouettes, the sloped desks, the high-backed chair that always looks like a thoughtful bishop, the ladder to the upper shelves. The cat stretches, discovers it has slept through the invention of 3 letter forms and 2 theological debates, and leaves a hair on history. Doors are closed, not with a bang, but with a negotiated hush. The sky performs the complicated mathematics of stars, not because anyone is watching, but because that is its vocation. And the pages, those patient squares of prepared life, cool toward morning. What remains is the body's memory of small, precise movements. Fingers keep writing in sleep, tracing curious alphabets onto blankets. The mind mutters abbreviations as if they were prayers, etc. Amen, Deo gratias. In dreams, a choir is always 1 leaf short until you find it under a cat. The work is not heroic. It is faithful. It will continue tomorrow and the day after, until a book exists that can lie open on an altar like a contained sea, or on a lectern in a library chained for the book's own protection, or in someone's hands by candlelight during a storm when the world needs to be read in a voice that doesn't shake. The scriptorium does not hurry this into being. It proceeds gently, like someone walking while balancing a bowl of water. If the night presses your eyelids kindly, let it. The quills are sleeping. The ink has formed a thin skin that will be peeled away in the morning with a small, satisfying sound. The parchment breathes like a held note. The books wait behind doors that will open with a key the size of a finger bone. Somewhere a bell rehearses tomorrow's hours under its breath. And the scribe, yawning a little, count stitches in his sleeve until the numbers fold into each other and the mind becomes a margin at last. Should you wake during the small hours, you might hear the silence practicing its letters, but likely you will not. You will be busy with a dream that walks calmly down a ruled line, pauses at a red capital, and then, without fanfare, turns the page. You might not expect your first breath of the day to taste like yesterday's fire, but in Victorian London, it usually did. The city woke under a quilt of coal smoke that had spent the night getting comfortable in every fold of air. Fog, which in other climates can be a poet, learned here to carry a pocket full of soot. It curled into rooms through keyholes and under window sashes that didn't believe in a snug fit. People called it a pea super, which is a very kind name for something that turned lampposts into ghosts and made handkerchiefs the color of remorse. Even indoors, the morning dust had ambitions. Ash crept into tea tins and settled on loaves, the way a cat settles on the single chair you do plan to sit in. If you re somehow still awake when we reach the part about why London bread sometimes crunched like a beach holiday, feel free to subscribe, but truly, don't strain anything. The city will keep without you. Breathing was practical choreography. You learned, without ever calling it a skill, to pull air through a scarf, or to angle your face so the wind could do what it could. Chimney sweeps had early appointments with dawn-thin boys who moved through flues like letters through, envelopes leaving behind clean brick and a persuasive cough. A servant rattled the grate to shake loose yesterday's fire, an action the city experienced as an affectionate tickle, and outside, thousands of chimneys answered, obligingly, with smoke. The sun persisted and managed a bleached kind of daylight that felt less like illumination and more like an apology. If you coughed in a polite two-syllable way, no one remarked. If you coughed in paragraphs, someone might suggest a tonic advertised in the newspaper by a gentleman with an unusually vigorous mustache. Breakfast, depending on your budget and your tolerance for chemistry, could be a modest adventure. Water was a creature with a social life. It mingled where it pleased and liked the company of microbes that did not yet have publicists. Many households fetched their supply from the Thames or from pumps that were politely downstream of everything interesting laundries, slaughterhouses, and the city's other opinions about hygiene. Boiling helped, although kettles were shy about speed. Milk, which had been transported in open churns at the pace of a tired horse through streets with a busy manure schedule, arrived with the soft flavor of travel and sometimes the added generosity of chalk or flour. Bread liked to be more bread than it strictly was. Alum kept it fashionably white, and plaster dust rumored itself into certain loaves, as if builders had moonlighted as bakers and brought their hobbies along. Eggs were trustworthy if you were good at guessing, and tea did frank work, even when asked to dissolve small surprises. Street food promised calories with promptness. A man with eels arranged in a shining, persuasive heap promised protein that wriggled no more and aspired to comfort. Whelk sellers set out their bowls, vinegar lifting its voice modestly above the rivers. Fried potatoes appeared in hot, pleasant scoops, and a pie man carried a tray strapped to his neck, the aroma of pepper legislating away any doubts. If you happened to buy a sausage, you might meet breadcrumbs again in their second career. A woman with a stand sold coffee that politely declined to be coffee and settled for being hot. The market's soundtrack was the music of cries. Watercress, fine watercress, hot spiced gingerbread, and the unsung chorus of street preachers and newsboys fencing with syllables under the same smudged sky. By the time the city's second breath arrived, the streets had achieved their signature multiplication. London preferred population in generous quantities, and it made sure the citizens met each other promptly. Alleyways were thin decisions between buildings, and staircases led to rooms that were also staircases. A man selling onions might share a doorway with a family sharing a mattress, and everyone shared the air. The rookeries, those neighborhoods whose nickname sounded like a bird sanctuary, yet somehow wasn't to stacked life and vertical layers. Cellar, ground, garret, and the floor no one counted. Laundry stitched itself across alleys like small flags declaring, "We were washed once." And wherever the city narrowed, fingers with a gift for pockets practiced their craft. Pickpockets worked in teams with choreography you could almost admire if you hadn't intended to eat with that coin. You learned the street's informal language, or you learned to replace your belongings. A passing brush that felt like friendship signaled less friendly intentions. Children, quicker than doubt, worked in little swarms, the smallest acting the preface while the largest wrote the conclusion. Police, blue-coated and endowed with new discipline, patrolled in pairs and bore numbers you could politely memorize if help seemed wise. They were called bobbies or peelers, affectionate names derived from their inventor's surname, and they introduced the idea that the city could be watched with order instead of improvised frowning. Still, London possessed corners where law preferred to be theoretical, and in those places a man's reputation did as much work as any statute. Horses wrote most of the city's prose. They pulled omnibuses, drays, and wagons that had strong opinions about cobbles. Each horse contributed daily to the municipal compost program, 20 or so pounds at a time, and all that generosity met rain with predictable results. Mud was not a metaphor. It was a chemistry you crossed with your hem rearranged above your boots. If you had boots and a prayer for your balance, whether or not you had prayers, the job of crossing sweeper existed purely to carve a relatively decent path through this mixture, which suggests both the scale of the problem and the human desire to keep a shoe conversing politely with itself. Open drains conducted their negotiations visibly. Even after engineers began tunneling new sewers underfoot, the city above kept to its habits in a friendly, habitual way. Londoners learned to judge puddles as a skill. Some puddles were shallow and eager, others were deep and philosophical. If you wished, you could purchase a handkerchief and graduate to a 2-handkerchief day by lunchtime. Soot, being democratic, introduced itself to velvet and sackcloth without discrimination. The smart set wore black, which was flattering to grime and, incidentally, to the fashion of mourning that the era practiced with the kind of professional consistency. Children found work in whatever labor could be performed at their height. Mudlarks, wading the foreshore, learned the tides by practical theology and gathered lost hardware, coal, rope, and sometimes a coin with a history. Toshers explored sewers and knew the city from beneath, where artifacts of carelessness collected like a second economy. Pure finders collected dog dung for the tanners, a job that proves the Victorians had a word for absolutely everything. By afternoon, the factories had warmed up to their daily stride, and the air above them wrote its black cursive in the sky. Mills and foundries opened their mouths and sang a song in the key of clink, with harmonies by steam. The workday was a long, narrow corridor lined with tasks. In a cotton mill, rooms rattled with machine rhythm, shuttles flicking back and forth like tongues saying no. In matches, the phosphorus gave off a shy green glow and a particular smell. It also made a slow, vindictive acquaintance with jawbones, a condition the newspapers nicknamed with cheerful cruelty. In printing houses, inked letters kissed paper and left alphabets like footprints, the process both miraculous and sooty. A boy crawled under a loom to dislodge a thread and learned to measure danger to the width of a finger. The clock did not hurry. Noon was a rumor. Supper was a belief system. Regulation arrived in installments. Parliament passed acts the way a careful cook adds water to something determined to scorch, steadily with a spoon. One act shortened hours for certain ages. Another noticed that mines were not appropriate playgrounds for the smallest. The factory acts made paperwork into a guardian and suggested windows might open because lungs enjoy company with air. Still, a workday could be 12 hours if you were willing or too tired to be unwilling, and a week was a belt without a very interesting buckle. Piecework introduced math into families, More stitches meant more bread, and more bread meant the trick of getting up again tomorrow. The needle respected speed and punished daydreams. When luck stumbled, the workhouse stood on its square of ground like an answer nobody wanted to hear. It offered shelter under conditions that made a floor look like a choice. The poor law had reshaped charity into a system that was clear-eyed and not famous for its warmth. Families were separated so efficiently that they became essays on the topic. Workhouses practiced economies like gruel, which is the culinary version of being read a stern letter. Once inside, you might be set to picking oakum teasing apart old rope with a blunt iron nail so that ships could have better seams. It was work that went nowhere beautifully and had a talent for turning hands into maps of irritation. If you preferred outdoors, the treadwheel could introduce you to the horizon in careful, repetitive increments that powered nothing but obedience. Justice favored display. Until 1868, hangings were public and instructional, though the lesson everyone learned was that humans will stare at anything for the price of a morning. Afterward, the gallows moved inside, and respectability borrowed a veil. The courts believed in black caps for death sentences and in birch rods for smaller opinions. Transportation to Australia fulfilled itself and then retired diplomatically. Prisons experimented with silence as a virtue. Men sat in their separate pens like thoughts arranged by a tidier brain. The Metropolitan Police, growing into themselves, kept notes and ledgers that looked optimistic about organization. On certain evenings, a magistrate could dispose of small crimes at a rate that suggested he had developed a wrist technique for sentencing. Evening filtered dawn with gaslight, which did not so much illuminate as make darkness reconsider its contract. Streets acquired halos around each lamp, small, respectable moons. Shop windows became stages. A gin palace woke, all glass and gilt, and threw its doors open to people who believed in anesthesia by the glass. The counters were long enough to suggest ambition. Mirrors multiplied faces into crowds that did not exist, and the floor learned the music of shoes. Gin came by the quartern, a measure shot that could sharpen or soften a day, depending on what the day had done to you. The law required food to be present, so there might be cheese in a guarded glass case, an object many remembered fondly from earlier shifts. Conversations bloomed like damp roses. Songs joined them, and opinions about Parliament pursued each other like kittens until closing time blew them out like a lamp. Elsewhere, the city's entertainments found shadowed accommodation. Music halls offered a mixture of songs, jokes, and acrobatics, a program stitched together with cheerful glue. Penny gaffs the small, enthusiastic theaters with budgets the size of Tutting-presented melodramas, where a mustache could indicate criminality on its own. There were houses where women worked under names they preferred for the night, and names the register would never learn. They practiced negotiation as a craft and discretion as a fence. A street in Soho knew how to pronounce laughter in several languages. Spittoons stood by like punctuation. A boy outside sold penny dreadfuls that promised murders with punctuation of their own, and readers who were not normally literary discovered they could turn pages at a fine pace. The night had its professionals. Prostitutes learned to read the map of danger in faces and shoes and the way a man held his hat. Policemen patrolled with a hand on the small rattle that had outlived its fashion but not its purpose. Street doctors carried bandages and advice that sometimes matched. Rescue societies walked their rescue routes with determination and a fondness for leaflets. Somewhere in the East End, the rumor of a figure in a dark coat slipped through conversation, a whisper with a sharp edge. Even at the time, the city nested sensational rumor in a soft blanket of speculation. Newspapers printed letters from people with handwriting and ideas about knife work and notoriety. By the time anyone tried to make facts of it, the fog had practiced its talent for editing. Disease moved quietly into the room as a fifth guest. The day's breathless coal dust, the crowded beds, and the water's favorite bacteria each brought their calling cards. Cholera visited in waves during certain years, and a physician named John Snow conducted an experiment as gentle as removing a pump handle. The map he drew is now famous in libraries. At the time, it was simply a piece of paper modestly saving lives. Smallpox kept showing up like a cousin who stored luggage in your hallway and never left. Tuberculosis practiced a slow, tragic rhythm that even poetry found tired. Still, people married, argued about who had borrowed which shawl, worried small worries, and laughed at jokes that translated poorly across centuries but made perfect sense after 3 days of poor sleep. By midnight, London looked like a city considering its options. The Thames slid by in its great charitable way, accepting the day's contributions with the stoicism of furniture. On the embankment, couples walked where engineers had poured the future into brick. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers had slipped under the city like a second, more hygienic London. Gas lamps defined a narrow corridor of visibility, and beyond them the darkness kept house. A cab rattled past with a tired horse and a driver who knew the price of oats better than arithmetic. In the distance, a factory's after-hours sigh rose like someone sitting down after a great deal of standing up. To live here required small techniques more than large heroics. You learned to hold a parcel against you on one side and an umbrella like a defensive thesis on the other. You chose boots with a thick mind and a forgiving soul. You kept coins in several pockets, an economic theory called diversification long before anyone spoke of portfolios. You cultivated a relationship with a crossing sweeper because the line between filthy and only somewhat filthy could be drawn by a broom in the right hands. You checked your chimney, your water, your neighbor's patience, and the weather, which could not be checked but could be humored. In rooms where the roof remembered yesterday's rain, people improvised comfort the way a musician improvises a melody within a narrow key. A teapot stood in for conversation. A pennyworth of coal managed to remember warmth if you arranged it closely, like friends on a bench. A cracked window pane accepted a slice of newspaper as a temporary philosophy. Children practiced games that could be paused at any moment for responsibility. Families gathered around a single candle, whose light had the personality of a patient aunt, and men did read aloud or argued amicably about nothing that will ever be in the archives. The city might have been loud outside. Inside, the small domestic noises, spoon, cup, the settled sigh of a chair made a quilt of sound that could be slept under. If you required respectable diversions, a circulating library would rent you a novel that stretched across 3 volumes and as many months. Reading by gaslight cast everyone in a flattering yellow, as if they had been lightly toasted. Serial chapters arrived in magazines that made cliffhangers into a household ritual. You could time the week by installments and the year by bindings. The news carried sketches of Parliament doing its long, interpretive dance with policy. Advertisements celebrated miracle devices that could improve your complexion, your digestion, your morals, and your piano playing, sometimes all at once. A man offered life insurance on favorable terms. Another sold a patent stove that used less of the coal you had less of. Closing time was a gradual event, a tide rather than a bell. Pubs poured one last quartern with the dignity of a curtain call. Lanterns winked shut in an order that mapped an entire neighborhood's sleep habits. The watchman, who loved repetition the way certain birds love polished objects, tested the door of a shop that had already been tested, and found it again obedient. A last omnibus clattered by with a single passenger who had set his hat at an angle best described as philosophical surrender. Somewhere a baby made the early noises of a negotiator. Somewhere else, in a room that smelled faintly of beef tea and laundry, someone coughed the day out of his lungs and then, quite bravely, slept. This is the city most visitors wouldn't last a day in, not because London was malicious, but because it required that particular athleticism of attention look down for puddles, look up for signs, look sideways for hands that appreciate your pocket. It asked you to breathe cool with personality and to make friends with hot liquids. It expected you to read the air. And yet it managed a steady tenderness, a lamplighter tipping his hat to a child. A market woman adding a bruised apple to your bag because kindness had not yet learned to itemize a constable, walking someone home who did not admit to needing it. Even the fog, which aspired to be permanent, lifted eventually, and when it did, windows were opened with the wary hopefulness of a patient on the first day without a fever. If sleep invites you now, take it gently, the Victorian way, with a shawl and a confession to your pillow that tomorrow you will attempt the streets again with better boots. The city will continue making its complicated tea. The Thames will carry secrets to the sea with an air of not gossiping. The last cabs will turn back to their yards, and horses will unhook themselves from the day. Somewhere a printer's devil will lay out a new page, and somewhere else a laundress's kettle will rest before its morning argument with linen. The fog will memorize the rooftops and forget you, which is very kind of it. And in the quiet that finally arrives, you can hear London doing what it did best, breathing slowly through its 1,000 mouths, while the night folds itself like a newspaper and sets itself aside. You might not expect a morning to arrive already seasoned, but in Victorian London, the dawn came lightly dusted with yesterday's chimneys. The air wore soot like a sweater that had been washed too seldom and dried too near the fire. Fog slouched in from the river and politely introduced itself to every gas lamp and window sash, then seated itself on your tongue with the manners of a guest who plans to stay through lunch. People gave it comfortable names, London particular, as if it were a soup and you learned to breathe through a scarf, which did almost nothing but felt responsible. The sun made appearances like a shy actor, stepping onto the stage and then remembering it had lines to rehearse elsewhere. Even the laundry on the lines came down with a new color called urban. If you were still awake by the time we reached the part where coffee was often not coffee and milk practiced amateur geology, you can subscribe. Or you can let the subscription idea nap next to you. Victorian London believed in both ambition and sitting down for a moment. First things first, breath. Coal was the city's favorite spice, and chimneys its generous grinders. Stoves glowed, grates rattled, and the roofs exhaled in a slow black chorus. Your handkerchief, that embroidered essay in manners, graduated from accessory to equipment. Gentlemen folded theirs with neat, wheezing pride. Ladies carried versions that had known a better morning. The fog left corners and crept under doors the way small cats do. People who could afford it kept a second set of curtains solely for winter, not because they were warmer, but because the first set wished to retire honorably from service to soot. A lamplighter passed like a minor constellation, pole in hand, unwinding the night one bubble of flame at a time, and the glass globes above him took on halos that made the street look faintly holy and faintly damp. Then breakfast, or whatever could be persuaded to behave like breakfast. Water, which nowadays is content to be boring, had a rich Sicil calendar. Pumps drew from bright-sounding wells that were, geographically speaking, on the wrong side of other people's habits. Tea was insurance and ceremony. Water met leaves, leaves met heat, and the whole arrangement became hopeful. Milk arrived in open churns and collected stories as it rolled through town bits of dust. The rumor of salmonella, a whisper of chalk when the dealer's conscience was writing with a tired pencil. Bread, too eager to be white, sometimes wore a dusting of alum, as if it had been trying on cosmetic powder and forgot to wipe it off. Butter went further if the cow's biography was supplemented by water. Eggs were trustworthy until they weren't, and there existed skilled citizens who could judge their age by a shake near the ear. The original podcast. Street food offered vitality wrapped in speed. Hot potato vendors ladled comfort into cold hands. The steam smelled like mercy. Eel pies glittered under gelatine roofs, each one a tiny maritime promise. Coffee stalls brewed a dark optimism that may once have greeted a coffee bean, or at least waved at one across a crowded dock. A pieman sang the inventory, words stitched to a melody every belly understood. The newspapers thoughtfully carried advertisements for tonics that could strengthen the constitution, improve spirits, and relocate your ailments to a less fashionable neighborhood. If breakfast tasted faintly like the river, you looked at the sky and decided that perhaps the sky tasted faintly like breakfast. By mid-morning, you set out and learned that walking in London was a subject with homework. Streets specialized in communicating the city's enthusiasm for horses. Omnibuses rattled with a confident clatter, and cabs cut through like punctuation marks, firm and unmusical. Each horse contributed a daily essay to the pavement, and the essays multiplied into anthologies. When it rained, and it liked to, these anthologies turned into a collaborative project with the street's mud. Crossing sweepers, entrepreneurs armed with brooms and optimism, negotiated narrow, clean ribbons across the sludge, and you tipped them not because etiquette demanded it, but because your boots consulted with your socks and begged you to participate in society. The city's lanes were crowded with professions that had invented themselves. Rag and bone men chanted for cast-offs and found economies in other people's punctuation. Mudlarks combed the Thames foreshore with practical theology, timing their search to the tide and their patience to the chill. Pure finders gathered dog dung for tanneries, a trade that proved the Victorians could coin a term and keep a straight face. Pickpockets moved through a crowd like talented bees, touching everyone and collecting sweetness only they appreciated. You learned to wear your wallet in the pocket closest to your thoughts, and to treat a pretty distraction like a lecture with a test at the end. The Metropolitan Police, newly respectable in blue, patrolled with numbered buttons and a patient rattle, collecting complaints and returning lost umbrellas that had lost the will to live. Where the alleys narrowed, the houses leaned toward each other as if discussing you. Rookeries layered rooms like cakes baked in a hurry. Cellar, parlor, bed, and the kind of loft where a person could stand if they were willing to negotiate with the slope of the roof. Laundry strung between windows created temporary flags of surrender. In lodging houses, a penny bought you a rope to lean on literally, the famous penny sit-up, and tuppence might win you a bed that had met many people and learned from them a variety of dreams. Open drains traced stamp signatures along the curb, and even after Bazalgette's grand new sewers began their responsible labor beneath your feet, the city above continued in its old habits with the lovable stubbornness of an elderly cat. Factories and workshops beat out the afternoon like a drumline. In cotton mills, machines hummed at a volume that converted conversation into mime. In match factories, phosphorus glowed faintly and made acquaintances with jawbones that were better left unacquainted. In printing houses, letters assembled themselves into words with a tidy, inky satisfaction. Foundries blossomed sparks that tried, briefly, to be stars. The clock functioned as a suggestion more than a promise, and shifts ran long through the day until they met the evening head-on. Children worked because the family worked. Their small hands recruited wherever a small hand fit under looms, along belts, inside bottles, adjusting the city's appetite to the dimensions of childhood. Reform arrived like rain on stone slowly, audibly, and then all at once. Factory acts counted hours with a new seriousness and suggested that bodies should last longer than contracts. Inspectors learned the dance of showing up unannounced and being expected anyway. Still, many tasks filled 12 hours neatly, the way water fills a jar, and the week unfolded with the unruffled logic of routine. Piecework lived at home and turned parlors into quiet factories. Needles moved with the steady sympathy of insects, and eyes went long with tiredness. The ledger, that calm, rectangular philosophy, weighed each stitch with the same composure used for rent. For people whom luck had stepped around, the workhouse stood with institutional posture. It was welfare reimagined as architecture, beds in rows, food in measured verbs, silence as a budget line. Families went in together and discovered themselves alphabetized into separate departments, men here, women there, children a little farther out. Oakum picking teasing rope into fluff, colking trained hands to repeat a small ache until it became their opinion of time. The treadmill, a great wooden wheel to nowhere, introduced legs to endurance without destination. Administrators kept diaries whose handwriting was neat in the margins and hurried in the middle. Poverty, it turned out, produced paperwork as efficiently as anything else. Justice, interested in theater, tried cases with an eye for audience. Magistrates disposed of petty theft at a pace that could only be called conversational. Until 1868, executions were public, and the crowd arrived with sandwiches, proving that human curiosity travels with a packed lunch. Later, punishment moved indoors, and the gallows acquired a privacy screen. Respectability breathed out and purchased a new hat. Prisons experimented with a separate system, where each soul sat in its own box like a thought being carefully examined. Transportation to Australia dwindled and then retired. The ocean had acquired enough involuntary tourists for the century. The black cap, ceremonially donned for the death sentence, resembled a moral punctuation mark no one enjoyed using. Evening drifted down like an extra shawl, and the city tried on its shadows. Gaslight woke along the streets in a slow ripple, little moons teaching the dark to negotiate. Shop windows transformed into aquariums for silk boots and hats that promise respectability in exchange for savings. The gin palace, all glass and gilt, opened doors wide enough to drink in the neighborhood. Mirrors multiplied patrons until the room looked popular even on slow nights. A quartern of gin held the day at arm's length for the length of a song. Because the law insisted that drink be accompanied by food, there was always a plate of cheese under a bell jar, gazed upon like a minor celebrity. Conversations jumped like sparks from boot to boot. Elsewhere, the evening hosted a more complicated economy. Music halls offered songs with choruses that even shy voices could borrow. Penny theaters put melodrama in shoes that fit the price. Villains with mustaches that did their own acting, heroines who had trained in swooning. Down back streets, houses with red lamps traded names for nights and navigated the city's moral geometry with practiced discretion. Rooms were furnished in hope and wiped down in haste. The women who worked there managed accounts with sharper math than many gentlemen's clubs and negotiated safety in a language you learned only by listening with your life. The city's illnesses took a stroll after dark, but it was the kind of stroll that felt like moving back in. Cholera had come in earlier decades with a terrible efficiency, and though new sewers now carried away some of the risk, people still told stories about a pump handle and a map that saved a neighborhood Jon Snow, as quiet detective work which proved that sometimes the hero is a wrench and a pencil. Smallpox made periodic visits and left distinctive calling cards. Tuberculosis sang its long, thin song in parlors where the only other music was the kettle's sigh. Newspapers folded into pockets carried rumors about knives in Whitechapel, and though the fog loved to embroider, fear did the hemming. Night's procession continued. Costermongers counted earnings. The last omnibus clattered home. A printer's devil inked his fingers, setting the morning's headlines. And policemen checked doors with the patience of monks. On cold nights, the city sounded almost like itself, thinking steam, hoof, a far bell, the whisper of the river moving opinions to the sea. In lodging houses, the four-penny coffin, a narrow bed with walls of wood, claimed its sleepers in tight rows. In better houses, fires burned low, and the clock said kind things to the silence every hour on the hour. London settled to its haunches like a tired dog and discovered, as tired dogs do, that rest makes the next day possible. You wouldn't last a day, they say, and perhaps you wouldn't, but that's because London's day was designed like a glove for a particular hand. It expected you to know things no one told you, how to step where a wheel has pressed the mud firm, how to test a street lamp's halo for safety, how to carry bread by the crust so the stick gets caught at the edge and not in the center, how to lift your skirts or your trousers just enough, how to walk with purpose, but not the kind of purpose that reads, I am new and have coin. It expected you to accept that small discomforts are loopholes in a larger disaster being averted by caution, luck, and tea, and yet the city made room for tenderness. A crossing sweeper saved you from a puddle that would have rewritten your afternoon, and you gave him the coin that would rewrite his. A shopkeeper kept aside the better loaf for a widow who had never asked. A lamplighter, long done with his route, looked back and relit a stubborn extinguished globe, because even gaslights have moods. A cabman, recognizing the limits of a horse, walked beside the cab for the last stretch, so the animal could hear footsteps and believe the world less heavy. Mercy kept house in odd corners, and while history remembered the smoke, people who lived it remembered these smaller weathers. If your eyelids are heavy now, you are already doing London correctly. It was a city that survived by napping in increments, a porter leaning on a gatepost for 2 minutes between carts, a seamstress blinking twice too long, a clerk letting the pen rest while the gas flame made a low, persuasive music. Let your thoughts drift like the Thames slipping around its piers, carrying away the day's crumbs and keeping the useful secrets. Somewhere a kettle is beginning to think about boiling. Somewhere a baker is sliding trays into an oven that never really cools. Somewhere a policeman is counting the stars between two buildings and getting different answers each night. Morning will come again pre-seasoned, and the first breath will arrive with context. But there's time before that, plenty of it, soft and suitless, where the fog cannot reach and the city's noises are just distant punctuation in a long, comfortable sentence. Set your handkerchief aside. The lamplighter has finished his constellation. The river is carrying on with its slow, polite conversation. And London, that tireless essay, folds itself at the corner, places a saucer over the cup to keep the heat in, and yawns without embarrassment. You might not expect the morning to arrive tasting faintly of yesterday's fires, but in Victorian London, the first breath of the day came pre-seasoned. The air had a manner to it, a kind of smoky politeness, as if the chimneys had sat up all night writing postcards to your lungs, and were now hand-delivering them in a fog the color of oversteeped tea. People gave it gentle nicknames, London particular, like a soup, and pulled scarves across their faces with the quiet optimism of someone placing a napkin on a lap just before a very splashy meal. A lamplighter made his return trip at dawn, nipping shut the last gas flames with a small iron cap, and the glass globes kept their halo for a minute before remembering what street they were on. Clotheslines accepted a light dusting of coal the way a cake accepts powdered sugar, and window ledges collected, set as if saving up for a small personal mountain. If you're still awake by the time we get to the cheerful practice of stretching, milk with water and brightening bread with alum, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Victorian London would have respected your decision to do nothing vigorously. Breathing was only the first little assignment. You also learned the art of navigation. By nose. Coal smoke suggested breakfast somewhere, and somewhere else, the Thames rehearsed its lines from memory. On very good mornings, you could smell horses before you saw them, which was helpful planning. People rubbed lampblack from their eyelids without comment, and checked hats for a new ring of grit-top hats, kept it like a halo. Knocker-ups human. Alarm clocks with long poles or pea-shooters tapped windows to coax workers out of bed. A gentle percussion that made the city wake like a large orchestra tuning one instrument at a time. Even the birds sounded a bit gravelly, as if the sparrows had taken up pipe smoking. Breakfast, when it happened, was an exercise in enthusiasm. Water, which we now consider fairly self-sufficient, had a more complicated lifestyle. Street pumps drew from wells that were well connected socially, if not hygienically. Boiling turned suspicion into tea, the nation's favorite disinfectant disguised as a hug. Milk arrived in open churns with great confidence and a side career in chemistry. Dealers sometimes thinned it with river ambition, corrected the color with a whisk of chalk, and sweetened its disposition with treacle. Bread wished sincerely to be white and sometimes achieved this with the cosmetic help of alum and rice flour, a sort of edible laundry. Coffee stalls poured something dark and encouraging that had shaken hands with coffee or at least waved from across the dock. Chicory did a lot of the heavy lifting. Street vendors sang the inventory hot potatoes, chestnuts, eel pies sitting under gelatinous roofs that looked like little winter ponds. The newsboys sold papers that folded neatly around fish, and fish returned the favor with a certain personality at breakfast. You stepped outside into a geography of elbows. Alleys narrowed to the width of a decision. Buildings leaned toward each other in friendly conspiracy, their upper floors nearly shaking hands over your head, as if to share gossip about passers-by. Overcrowding wasn't a condition so much as an architectural style. Children spilled into the street with practiced alertness, dodging wheels that moved like punctuation periods were drays. Commas were handsoms, exclamation points were cabs in a hurry. A crossing sweeper worked a broom with entrepreneurial grace, carving clean pathways across a democracy of mud. You paid him because shoes are the soul of the day, and also because he knew where the pavement ended and the essay began, the cities. Professions announced themselves like a parade of footnotes. Mudlarks combed the river's edge at low tide, hoping the Thames had changed its mind about a coin. Rag and bone men sang for cast-offs, building empires of thread and metal. Cat's meat men made rounds with skewers of boiled horse, as beloved by pets as the finest patisserie. Pure finders gathered dog dung for tanneries. The trade name was tidy enough to bring to dinner. Pickpockets practiced gentle surgery on pockets that thought they were safe. They were not. You learned to wear coins close and hopes closer. The new Metropolitan Police, looking splendid in blue, walked a steady geometry and addressed the public in voices calm enough to iron a shirt. Their numbered buttons made everyone feel that order could be itemized. Where the streets widened, horses secured the vote. They left essays on the cobbles. Rain turned essays into novels. Wheelwrights kept their own calendars, filling and emptying with loyal regularity. The city smelled of iron and oranges, the latter from street barrows piled high enough to make winter look forgiving. Above your head, laundry had diplomatic meetings with the fog. Below your feet, a newer world was being built. Sir Joseph Bazalgette's great brick sewers, handsomely arched and responsibly sloped, carried away what the city would rather not discuss at breakfast. When they first began to do their work, the Thames appeared to take a thoughtful breath. People talked, with relief that sounded like prayer, about the year of the Great Stink and how a good engineer had given the nose a holiday. London did not so much begin as continue. Factories and workshops behaved like clocks that had swallowed other clocks. In textile rooms, the looms rattled with a cheerful menace, and speech became a mime with subtitles guessed from the eyes. Match factories glowed faintly at the jaw phosphorus, left its calling card as a greenish pain known by everyone and preferred by no one. Fancy paper boxes acquired their corners under nimble fingers. Furniture grew from forests into parlors by way of sawdust and glue. Tinsmiths tapped metal like punctuation, and printers' devils ran with hands tattooed in ink. You learned to count time in pieces, the way a seamstress does so many hems to the hour, so many hours to the rent, and rent always arriving before the end of the sentence. Children's labor fit wherever a small hand fit. Chimney sweeps wriggled up flues that adults couldn't approach. Coming down sooted and celebrated for their usefulness in a way that felt like praise but worked like payment. Street sellers aged out of childhood by the measure of their shout. Reforms came politely, then insistently. The factory axe cut hours with scissors that dulled slowly. The 10 hours movement argued that 10 was a nice number, symmetrical, and solid. Inspectors learned the art of being expected unannounced. Improvement had a bureaucratic gait, which is to say, arrived, but not quickly. For those who intersected too closely with misfortune, the workhouse waited with a posture like a straight-back chair. It offered food, shelter, order, and the careful division of families into compartments labeled for safekeeping. Oakum picking teasing old rope into fluff-occupied fingers while time wrote its endless paragraph. The treadmill allowed legs to practice going nowhere with admirable endurance. Clerks kept ledgers so tidy that a droplet of ink looked like misbehavior. The poor law was designed with strict benevolence, like a winter coat that buttoned from the outside. Justice worked as theater with practical seating. Magistrates skimmed small crimes like pebbles, seeing how many bounced before they sank. Until the late 1860s, public executions drew crowds with the determined curiosity of any free event. Later, the business went indoors, where privacy could wear a tie. Prisons considered reform with architectural seriousness, experimenting with the separate system cells arranged like thoughts stored carefully in drawers. Transportation to Australia faded. The ocean had collected enough reluctant biographies. The black cap, placed on a judge's head for sentencing, remained purely ceremonial, like thunder without rain dot evening folded over the rooftops and made the city handsome in profile. Gaslight slid down the streets in a slow yawn. Each lamp kept a small, steady star and hummed to moths. Shop windows turned into shallow aquariums where boots swam in pairs and hats proposed futures to people lingering outside. The music hall warmed up its pianos and jokes. Songs with choruses a person could adopt traveled from table to table like helpful relatives. Penny faders obliged the appetite for drama with villains whose mustaches won awards. People went out to be less alone in company, which is one of humanity's better inventions. Gin palaces conducted their business in gilt and glass. Mirrors multiplied patrons until even a slow night looked sociable. The counter displayed cheese under a bow. Char, a requirement of licensing law and a consolation to the conscience. Barmaids sharp as pins, fast as arithmetic, kept the pump handles moving. The poor drank because water had a suspicious resume. The less poor drank to agree with them. Somewhere, a temperance lecturer in a respectable hall was doing his level best, and outside, a man with a cart full of hot pies was doing better. Down narrower lanes, the night practiced discretion. Houses marked with a quiet red lamp offered companionship and denominations of time. The women who worked there read people the way a clerk reads a bill, noting totals and hidden charges at once. They kept safety rules unprinted but unbreakable, and exchanged information with each other faster than the newspapers could. Some found patrons, some found trouble. All found the city to be a conversation carried on too late and in too many rooms. Respectability walked past quickly, pretending to know the time. Disease preferred the evening because everyone was at home to answer the door. Tuberculosis took a chair by the hearth and coughed delicately. Smallpox knocked less politely. Cholera, earlier in the century, had arrived with unambiguous speed, making a map and a pump handle famous when Dr. John Snow took the handle off and the neighborhood breathed again. Even after the great sewers, rumors clung like fog to the low places, and people told their children not to play by the ditch that told stories. Newspapers took a morbid interest in certain murders in Whitechapel. The city, already anxious from the fog's embroidery, read the headlines, locked doors with extra feeling, and went on getting up for work in the morning because that was what Londoners did between anxieties. The night had its own professions. Watchmen checked doors with a tender rattle. Prostitutes counted steps and exits the way sailors count ropes. Costermongers settled accounts, their barrows at rest like tired ponies. Printers inked tomorrow into being with rollers that looked like tame thunder. A newsboy slept on a pile of uncut papers as if truths could be pillows. The river moved forward with imperturbable manners, carrying everything the city told it and keeping some secrets to itself, the way a good friend does. You wouldn't muss today, they say, and perhaps you wouldn't, but that is not your fault. A London day was a specialized craft. It required the ankles of a dancer, the lungs of an optimist, and the budget of a mathematician. It asked you to know when to tip a crossing sweeper, how to breathe through a scarf without feeling important, which alley smelled trustworthy, and which baker sold loaves that did not glow faintly in the moonlight. It asked you to judge a sky by its color for rain, a horse by the angle of its ears, and a stranger by the speed of his pockets. It asked you to be kind in small, continuous ways, give up a seat, hand over a coin, buy an extra hot potato because you could and someone couldn't. If all that sounds like too much, you can set it down. The lamplighter has already gone to bed. The fog, deciding it has done enough for one day, has folded itself like a shawl on the back of a chair. Somewhere a kettle is beginning to consider boiling. Somewhere a baker is pushing the first loaves into an oven that never quite cools. Somewhere a policeman is counting the stars between two buildings and getting a different answer each time. The city is still speaking, but softer now, as if it has moved to the other end of the room. Let the soot and the songs drift to the edge of hearing. There is a rope bed waiting for you in a warm lodging house, or a better bed in a quieter street, or simply the knowledge that beds exist and that people are lying down in them, turning faces toward the wall with a small, unanimous sigh dot. Close your eyes. Keep the useful facts and let the rest go. The crossing sweeper will be there in the morning with his broom held like a violin. The gas lamps will blink awake one by one tomorrow evening, as they always do. London will continue its long, comfortable sentence, adding commas where necessary, never in a hurry to find the final period. And you can drift, suitless at last, while the city keeps breathing for you, slowly, endlessly, like a great animal asleep beside the river. You might not think the air could introduce itself before you even open the door, but in Victorian London, the morning came with a calling card. It drifted in through keyholes, under sashes, and up stairwells. A cozy gray that said good day while politely making a small home inside your lungs. Chimneys were the city's chorus line. They kicked on every roof and shook down fine black confetti. Coals slept lightly and woke moody, which is to say they smoked first and burned later. People learned to polish their boots in the evening, and again in the morning, as if the night had been a party for soot. Even a closed book gathered a slim shadow along its edges, a reminder that reading here involved the eyes, the hands, and occasionally a damp cloth. Somewhere in the next street, a lamplighter pinched out the last stubborn flame with his little extinguisher, moving methodically as a man who knew he would be asked to relight them all in about 12 hours. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about the official public advice to boil your water and your skepticism, you're doing wonderfully. Feel free to subscribe in a drowsy, historical way. Think of it as putting a marker in the book and then close your eyes again, because commas are perfectly good places to rest. The first lungful was free, the second arrived with extras. London's fogs, the celebrated London particular, carried tiny crystals of coal that turned a linen handkerchief into a survey map. Street sweepers worked in gentle figure eights, knowing the wind would erase their efforts with affectionate speed. The city smelled seasonal even when it wasn't. Winter had notes of fireplace and cabbage. Summer offered warm tar and oranges from barrows arranged like small suns. There were rules of survival. Keep a scarf ready. Walk with your mouth closed when cartwheels pass. The mud throws its voice. Save your hair washing for a day when the air is feeling charitable. Curtains, which once were decorations, became filters of last resort. Even church bells sounded muffled, as if rung inside a teapot. Breakfast was an optimistic enterprise. Water looked innocent in the jug and less so at the pump. Some pumps had reputations, and people avoided them the way you avoid chairs that remember a cat. Boiling helped, provided you could afford both time and fuel. Otherwise, tea stood in as a sort of edible helmet. Milk arrived by the pail and was thought to be improved by the honest addition of water, a dash of chalk to restore its complexion, and sometimes a generous dollop of the dealer's imagination. Bread wanted to be white and sometimes achieved. A fashionable pallor with alum, which was not exactly a spice but wore a similar expression in the mixing bowl. If you preferred something hearty, there were eels, boiled or jellied, wearing their stock like a winter scarf. Coffee stalls offered hot, aromatic comfort that had waved politely at coffee somewhere on the docks. Chicory did most of the work and never complained. People stood shoulder to shoulder, drinking out of shared mugs wiped with an apron that had met thousands of lips and maintained a diplomatic silence about all of them dawed by the time you reached the street. The city had already broken into small negotiations. There were more people than pavement and more errands than time. Narrow lanes behaved like funnels, widening just enough to make you hopeful before presenting a cart lodged like a cork. Shop boys zagged with parcels that looked bigger than their instructions. Street vendors sang their inventories in keys that argued with each other. Watercress shrilled. Muffins chimed. The cat's meat man persisted. Pickpockets moved with a craftsman's pride. Their best trick was politeness. You learned to keep. Coin in hand in the same pocket and your other hand free to apologize stylishly. Gangs had territories, as did geese, and both could be avoided with practice. The new blue-coated policeman walked in pairs with an air of steady arithmetic, numbering problems until the problems remembered how to behave. Their truncheons gleamed like well-fed pencils. At crossings you met the empire of the horse. The city's arguments were settled by hooves. A hansom cab rolled like a clever thought. An omnibus lumbered like a paragraph that refused to end. Between wheel and curb lay a constituency of mud, straw, apple peels, and the practical contributions of animals. Crossing sweepers managed small realms of cleanliness with brooms that were part instrument, part wand. A penny bought you passage and a wink, both worth the price. When it rained, the streets developed honest lakes. Londoners stepped from island to island with the concentration of chess players. Every stone was a rule. If the wind turned rude, it carried the river to your nostrils, salt and iron, and something old enough to require a footnote. Bazalgette's grand new sewers began, in time, to lessen the river's monologues, arching away beneath the streets. Like vaulted basements for things that didn't want biographies. Work stirred the city like a spoon. Factories opened their doors and exhaled, and people poured in with lunch tied in cloth and time tied in knots. The world's goods were manufactured here with a confidence that left fingerprints, soap, matches, furniture, shirts, hats with opinions, boots with ambitions. In the spinning rooms, air grew furry with fibers that turned lungs into storage closets. In the match factories, white phosphorus added a pale glow to the evening and a more serious glow to the jaw, Fossy jaw, named with the kind of neatness that softened nothing. Printers leaned over forms, composing the day's argument in neat rows of lead. A boxmaker learned to fold corners by feel alone, a blind origami of wages. The clock watched everybody work. It had a stare. Shifts were not hours so much as chapters, and the chapter on consequences was well thumbed. Children learned the trades the way rain learns gutters by falling into them. A small boy could sweep a chimney as deftly as chimney smoke left it. No adult could compete. Young girls soldered tins with the patience of saints and the ventilation of wardrobes. Some sold flowers whose water in tin pails knew whole symphonies of germs. Others sold matches 2 at a time and hoped several more. Reform had a way of arriving on paper first and in reality later, like invitations to a party that change address twice. Inspectors existed, which was helpful, and were expected to turn up unexpectedly, which is more helpful, and were outnumbered, which is unsurprising. The factory axe snipped hours with shears that dulled under use but were nevertheless shears. For those who slid across fortune's greasy cobbles, the workhouse stood with squared shoulders. It offered shelter, food, rules, and a lesson in the economic properties of humility. Families were sorted into tidy categories like a well-run pantry. Husbands became a column, wives another, children a row that would eventually blend into the men's or women's, oakum picking teasing old rope into. New usefulness gave fingers something to do with their regret. The treadmill next door held its own philosophy of progress, a kind of staircase that never believed in upstairs. Clerks kept books so beautifully that misfortune looked well edited, which did not help but made everyone quieter. The justice system took pains to be visible. Magistrates dealt with the morning's haul of public intoxication, thefts so small they barely reached the counter, assaults of the kind that crowded rooms produce, and the occasional masterpiece of mischief. Judges wore wigs whose curls remembered. Better days. Public hangings went out of fashion late in the century, having been found to encourage attendance rather than improvement. Afterwards, executions took place in private, like awkward family conversations. Imprisonment experimented with architecture as morality separate cells arranged on radial plans so that punishment looked like a clock. Transportation to Australia dwindled as if the ocean had filed for retirement. Fines were common. So was the poor man's alternative to paying a fine, which was simply to be a little more imprisoned that evening, soft the city with yellow. Gaslight pressed itself into every reachable globe, running along the streets like a necklace someone had finally decided to wear. Shop windows became warm aquariums where hats swam in rows and kid gloves posed like sleeping eels. The music halls, with their pianos and their jokes. Choruses came pre-supplied with instructions, and audiences complied with evident relief. Between the acts, you could purchase a pie whose crust was a kind of treaty between flour and mystery. A man in the balcony invariably claimed a voice powerful enough to accompany the singer. He did, and he did not. Gym palaces looked newly invented each night. Glass glowed, brass winks multiplied in mirrors, and even the floor seemed varnished. With good intentions, licensing laws required food, so cheese attended drinking the way a well-behaved aunt attends a wedding. Spirits were quick, beer was social, and temperance societies did their patient arithmetic in nearby halls. Barmaids engineered civility at speeds that would embarrass trains. They remembered a name by the second visit and a trouble by the third. If you stood at the counter long enough, you could watch people refit themselves with hope and go out holding it carefully. Elsewhere, the city preferred curtains. Brothels worked in tones of red and brown, their windows courteously shaded, their accounts exact. The women running them possessed advanced degrees in risk management and etiquette. Clients were read with the speed and accuracy of a headline. Police alternated between raids and toleration. Paperwork did not enjoy ambiguity, but reality did. On warm nights, the narrow lanes in certain districts spoke many languages at once: Yiddish, Irish, Romany, Italian, carrying rumors about jobs, ships, relatives, and the price of potatoes. A barber stayed open late to shave those who needed to look honest in the morning. Illness walked the pavements like a familiar landlord. Cholera had made its famous appearance earlier, flipping through entire neighborhoods like a careless reader, until Dr. John Snow had the idea to remove a pump handle and, in the process, underline the sentence about contaminated water. Afterward, the sewers took on the starring role they had always wanted, and the Thames looked less offended. Yet tuberculosis continued to write love letters in blood-flecked handkerchiefs and smallpox-remembered addresses. The new germ theory proposed that the invisible was very busy. People nodded the way you nod when someone's right, and the kitchen still needs cleaning. Working-class mothers boiled sheets on Mondays with Monday's patients. Carbolic soap introduced itself with a smell some called medicinal and others called rude. The newspapers, those early practitioners of caffeinated storytelling, found themselves, in 1888, possessed of an exceedingly marketable villain. The murders in Whitechapel drew crowds to headlines and policemen to maps. For most Londoners, the evening still meant errands, work, supper, and bed. Fear was a visitor who stayed 2 streets away and left footprints in the newsprint. Respectable. Households discussed the matter and voices carved thin. Women who had always watched their corners watched them harder. Men promised to escort sisters, girlfriends, wives, and sometimes themselves. The city continued, as cities do, practicing everyday bravery, lighting fires, fetching milk, asking neighbors to check on the children, closing shutters against the air. We should talk quietly about sleep because London kept odd hours and expected you to make your own peace with them. Lodging house beds were economical devices that introduced strangers and elevated snoring to a form of public performance. Rope beds, the cheapest option, let you lean against a taut line that yielded. At dawn, the keeper cut it with a flourish, and the whole room woke as gently as laundry falling off a line. Better rooms had mattresses that remembered previous guests with philanthropic generosity, springs like polite handshakes, blankets heavy enough to count as conversation. Across the river, in larger houses, servants finished their last rounds, while the owners read one more page by gaslight that hissed like distant rain. The city hushed in patches. Markets slept heavily and smelled like the day's fruit turned over in its dreams. The docks muttered to themselves and counted cranes. Cats patrolled with professional seriousness. Dogs stood in doorways and discussed the news with their tails. Somewhere a printing press rattled out tomorrow, so that breakfast would have something to argue with. The postboys sorted mail in long, patient rooms and tied letters with string that had no idea how many promises it contained. Even the fog, that amiable thief, thinned toward midnight, as if stepping out for air. If all of this sounds like endurance, it was. But it was also choreography. A London day asked you to breathe smoke with good manners, to drink tea that was half prophylactic and half philosophy, to cross streets as if you were translating poetry, to work where machines spoke loudly and wages whispered, to endure laws written by tidy minds, and to find, in the evening, a pocket of warmth that turned gin into grammar. You would be forgiven for failing the audition on the first try. Most people did not so much live here as practice. You can rest now. The lamplighter has one more street and knows the steps by heart. A baker is sliding loaves into an oven that hums in the language of crust. Somewhere a mother tucks a child into a bed with its face to the wall and its back to the world, which is how courage sleeps. The river folds its broad gray blanket and pretends not to listen. If you want to keep breathing the London particular, imagine it getting softer, like felt, like the inside of a warm hat. Imagine Soot forgetting your name. The crossing sweeper has leaned his broom against the doorway and is dreaming of a day when he sweeps only fallen leaves. Tomorrow the city will undertake its familiar miracle, to wake up 10,000 small ambitions and let them jostle into something larger. But that is for later. For now the gaslights taper to a faint bead. A seamstress threads a needle in her. Sleep, and history sets down the pen with a careful click. You may drift quietly while London holds your place in the paragraph. You might not expect the morning to arrive pre-sliced, but in Victorian London it often did, The air served like a thick wedge you could almost spread on toast. Coal smoke had a habit of shaking hands with the mist and never letting go. Chimneys, muttered grate side, and every rooftop held a small black diary of yesterday's fires. People brushed ash from windowsills the way others dust crumbs from a tablecloth, and then drew the curtains again because the daylight felt like a draft. A knocker-up came along the street with a long cane, tapping at upper panes to wake heavy sleepers with gentle percussion. An alarm clock with legs, shoes, and gossip. Boots waited by the door like tin soldiers who had slept in their uniforms. They were blocked every night because the pavements, out of friendship, tried to turn everything the color of themselves. Even inside, the fog was the quiet third guest at breakfast, polite, gray, and not at all in a hurry, if you're still hanging. On by your eyelashes, you're doing splendidly. You may subscribe as one might put a ribbon in a book. No pressure, no trumpet. Just a sleepy promise to return when the kettle remembers the tune. Blink slowly. That counts as engagement here. Dot water was an optimist drink. Pumps were local. Celebrities with reputations like actors and sometimes the same tragic arcs. People still remembered the Broad Street handle that Dr. John Snow removed decades earlier. The way you remember a neighbor who finally solved the noise problem by taking away the violin. Boiling was recommended, provided your coal allowance was more than theoretical. Failing that, tea was the city's helmet. You wore it from the inside. Milk suffered from ambition and sometimes took artistic direction from chalk, water, or the ghost of a cow that had never met it. Bread wanted to be white and learned persuasive tricks from alum. Sweet things spent long afternoons with syrup that had technically been somewhere near sugar. Meanwhile, the stalls sang their inventories onto the street. Hot eels, pea soup, tarts, muffins, winkles by the pint. A coffee stall man wiped a tin mug with the apron of general history and added chicory to the brew until it saluted like a soldier. Tooth powders promised brightness and discreetly included brick dust, which did brighten and softly end permanently. Wallpaper leaned toward fashionable greens with arsenic doing the heavy lifting, as if the walls wished you a long life from an interesting distance. People read yesterday's paper through the new one, and tied scarves over noses like amateur. Chemists preparing for the walk to work. Outside, the city negotiated with itself. Alleys turned left because there was no room to turn right. Courts open like hinged suitcases, filled with laundry lines and friendly domestic weather. The rookeries had a talent for fitting more human life into four walls than seemed mathematically possible. 7 dials resembled a star drawn by an excitable child, every point a street insisting it was the main one. Costermongers navigated, the crowd with barrows so politely aggressive that the wheels themselves developed manners. Street sellers sang, and the chorus had everything, watercress and strawberries in spring, hot potato in winter, onions always, and ballads whenever the tune drifted close enough to catch. Pickpockets kept their hands in. It was, after all, their work. One bump from a gentleman's shoulder, one apology so crisp it could be filed, and a watch became an orphan. The Metropolitan Police walked through this gentle chaos in pairs, blue-coated and steady. Their new whistles, the famous thunderers, cut the air like gramophone needles before gramophones were fashionable to cut. Policemen preferred calm arithmetic. 2 constables, 1 problem, divide until quiet. And yet the streets had their own. Mathematics, more feet than flagstones, more errands than daylight, more reasons to hurry than space in which to do it. Mind the crossing, Mother said, because the empire of horses began there. Omnibus wheels wrote round arguments in the mud, hansom cabs made quick notes, and drays laid down underlines so thick they qualified as bold. Crossing sweepers presided over small islands of safety, offering a broom's width of civilization for a penny and a blessing. A pure finder passed with a basket, collecting dog droppings for the tanning yards. Industry is nothing if not thorough. Dustman rattled. By to negotiate ash and cinders into new lives as bricks and bottle glass. Mudlarks down at the river read the shoreline like a ledger, itemizing nails, rope, and coins too shy to return home. All of it sat on a complex underbelly. The great stink of 58 lingered in memory the way garlic lingers on a pan faint but determined. Parliament had flirted with retreat that summer. Curtains doused in chloride of lime while Joseph Bazalgette began to build the city's new bowels. Intercepting sewers as grand as cathedrals, the humbler in subject matter. They moved what needed. Moving, and the Thames began to smell more like a river and less like a footnote. Still, gutters kept their hobbies, and wet days invited everything downward. Londoners stepped from stone to stone with the concentration of chess players, planning 3 moves ahead and 1 puddle aside. Manufactories inhaled people in the morning and exhaled them at night, faintly powdered in whatever the day had offered. In textile rooms, the air turned fluffy, small clouds rehearsing indoors. Lungs participated whether they liked it or not. In match factories, white phosphorus applied itself to the cause of lighting the world, and unfortunately, sometimes the jawbone. Fossy jaw sounded almost friendly and was not. The name was a Victorian pastime, naming serious things as if for a pet. The Match Girls' strike of 1888, neat and noisy, taught the city that even young hands could ring a very large bell. Shirt-making carried on in garrets where irons had to be persuaded and candles groomed. Sweated labor believed in the savings that come from not counting time. Printers set whole arguments and lead, letter by letter, the sentences heavy enough to lift with both hands. Children worked because adults did, only closer to the machinery. Climbing boys wriggled through chimneys until an act finally decided that chimneys should be cleaned by brushes rather than by childhood. The brushes did not object. Boys swept factory floors, darting between belts with the confidence of cats. Girls soldered tins, pasted envelopes, and tied artificial flowers. Into condensing botany, a few sold lavender from straw baskets with patience that outlived the scent. Reform acts arrived like rain on a parched garden, a small miracle when it fell, a subject for grumbling when it didn't. Inspectors were thin on the ground and thick. In their notebooks. Just next door to work stood the workhouse, which was employment's cousin who believed strongly in order. It welcomed the desperate with separate doors for men, women, boys, and girls, then reorganized families the way libraries sort books, by size and subject. Meals were regular and gray. Porridge learned consistency as a way of life. Oakum picking and braiding. Old ship's rope into useful bits was the occupation of those who had come in sideways through misfortune. Casual wards offered one night's shelter in exchange for stone breaking or wood chopping in the morning, a difficult transaction conducted in blisters. The treadmill suggested improvement by the step. You climbed and arrived handsomely. Where you'd begun, magistrates kept the city tidy by conversation and sentence. Bow Street still remembered its runners, even though the new police did the running. Courtrooms were small theaters where the wigs had long lines and the audience was unwilling but attentive. Fines were common. Short sentences, too. Transportation to Australia wound itself down, the ocean-going solution gradually replaced by local architecture. Pentonville experimented with a separate system, a design in which silence did the talking. The last public hanging packed up its crowd in 1868, the gallows moving indoors with the discretion of a family piano. Meanwhile, birching, caning, and the moral geometry of the birch found employment in schools. Reformatories and stories told to keep children away from adventures with windows.night looked better on London than day. Sheerly in terms of lighting, gas flared along the streets like a necklace clasped after sunset, and shop windows staged miniature operas in glass. Music halls unrolled their posters, comic singers with reliable jokes, serio-comic ladies with fans that did a remarkable amount of work, tumblers who defied ceilings, and audiences who sang the choruses because that was part of the price of the ticket. Penny gaffes offered youth entertainment with fewer legal details. Theaters filled with actors who spent more time dying beautifully than sleeping. Even the pie shops became confident, the steam rising in persuasive paragraphs from the tin crust. You could drink Bovril by the cup and feel as though a cow had written you a supportive letter. And then there were the gin palaces, those brilliant aquariums of light and glass. Mirrors made the room into a conversation about itself. Brass rails sparkled for the pure pleasure of sparkling. Legislation demanded that drink be served with food, hence the sudden importance of the honest wedge of cheese. Barmaids learned their customers with a speed that made notebooks redundant, and the measuring of spirits achieved a theatrical precision. Temperance societies marched quietly past, with banners offering alternatives that sounded upright and tasted nearly so. Beer, of course, remained the solvent of class distinction. There is a strong argument that half of the city's diplomacy was conducted over a pint with a well-behaved head. Behind certain doors, shire economies did their arithmetic. Brothels varied from parlors, carefully upholstered in opinion, to rooms that understood the price of curtains. The Contagious Diseases Acts had tried to legislate disease and, being laws, had discovered both their reach and their limits. Royal debates preferred large fonts and small print. Rescue houses prayed, reformers wrote letters, and the women themselves did what they had always done, calculated with extraordinary accuracy. Policemen carried bullseye lanterns that put a circle of day where they pointed. Most of the time the circle fell on the everyday arguing neighbors. A drunk's quiet conversation with the curb, a boy taking a shortcut home through the longer streets dot in the late 1880s. Newspapers fell in love with the darkness that happened in Whitechapel, because news is drawn to shadows as moths are to lamps. Jack the Ripper's London was, for most Londoners, the same old London, with wider eyes and a new habit of reading signboards twice. Each division walked faster. Editors licked their pencils with a certain intensity. Penny dreadfuls found they could sell dread quite reasonably by the penny. Women carried companions or decided to be their own. Most nights were uneventful, and the city's most frequent dramas were negotiations with umbrellas. But the rumor of danger has a way of threading itself through laundry. Lines and tying nervous knots. Disease wandered at night because it had no job in the day. Tuberculosis coughed into handkerchiefs and addressed them to no one in particular. Typhus haunted overcrowded rooms the way leftover soup haunts a saucepan. Sanitary reformers published maps the color of worried fruit, showing where death liked to take afternoon walks. Doctors embraced germ theory with the relief of people who at last had names to write on invitations. Soap and carbolic began to receive more respect than poetry. Hospitals grew into institutions large enough to have good staircases. Meanwhile, midwives continued to be the best experts in their parishes and the least recognized in the midst of meetings. The night ended the way cities end things, gradually with a clearing of throats. Markets yawned. Covent Garden's roses prepared to impersonate morning. The fish porters at Billingsgate rehearsed their brisk ballet of baskets and banter, ignoring the gulls who believed they were management. Printers lifted up tomorrow in freshly dried sheets. Postmen arranged letters by street and door, tying them with string that was perfectly unaware of the secrets it contained. In lodging houses, rope beds relaxed dramatically at dawn when the keeper loosened the knothole. Rooms of humans delivered gently to the floor like laundry. In houses that had stairs, fires were poked back to life with the friendliness of old acquaintances. And then, without consulting anyone, the smog that had napped in corners stood and stretched. Boots waited for blacking, scarves negotiated with. Collars and a knocker-up pointed his cane toward another sleepy window. You might not last a day here, but that's all right. A day, strictly speaking, is not required. London did not so much expect endurance as consent, a willingness to breathe soup, to drink boiled philosophy, to walk chessboard gutters, to work where clock hands sometimes stayed because they were tired, and to let the night file down the edges of the afternoon. Close your eyes if you wish. The city will continue to print, to bake, to sweep crossings, to polish mirrors, to tuck smells into corners, to sort letters, to ring for time on the public clock, to whisper through grates, to count footfalls on wet stones, and to hold your place kindly in the paragraph where you left off. You might not expect a city to greet you with a flavor, but Victorian London does, and the flavor is coal politely shaken with fog. It arrives before the day does. Chimneys whisper to the sky, which whispers back, and between them they invent a kind of edible weather you can spread over toast if you have no butter. Curtains wake up gritty. A knocker-up strolls down the street with a long bamboo rod, tapping bedroom panes like a very tall metronome. He knows which windows belong to bakers, which to printers, which to the man who repairs umbrellas that had an honest disagreement with the wind. He may also use a pea shooter for second-floor skeptics. Nothing in the world convinces like a gentle pea to the glass. The street begins in muffled grays. Even the horses clear their throats. And if you're still awake by the time I reach the bit about arsenic wallpaper, feel free to subscribe, no need to move. Just let your eyelids do the paperwork. The first breath of the day tastes like yesterday's evening folded in half. On certain mornings, the famous pea super fog sets up house indoors and pats the furniture as if checking the time. Families negotiate the fireplace like diplomats. Coal is weighed, counted, and committed. The scuttle becomes a ledger. A housemaid lays the fire with skill elegant enough to be embroidery, and the flame answers in a tight, polite blush. If the chimney has not been recently brushed by a human child discontinued by law, but as laws go, occasionally interpreted like a recipe, a room may share an unscheduled message of soot. Street cries filter in, watercress, fine, and peppery. Cats meet for the darlings. From somewhere far too near, a man advertises hot eels with a voice that sounds prepared to boil water without assistance. These are not alarms. They are lullabies with errands. Breakfast, like the city, considers economy a virtue. Boiled water is an aspiration. Pumps gather reputations, the bold, the tepid, the suspiciously convenient. Everyone remembers the Broad Street pump that once kept cholera busy. Its handle was removed with the ceremony of a small coronation, and Londoners still retell the story with the calm joy of people who survived something by listening to a man who liked maps. Milk is enthusiastic and may include additions chalk for color, water for personality. Bread sometimes learns its grammar from alum, which keeps it white and keeps your stomach dedicated to the study of minerals. Jam is ambitious. It has read about strawberries and is doing its best to capture the general idea. Coffee stalls appear at corners like friendly punctuation, their kettles singing in tinny falsetto. The brew wears a top note of chicory, a thrifty flourish, and the cup is wiped with a cloth that knows the morning intimately. If you want a micro hook, here's one. Tooth powder can be brightened with a whisper of brick dust. The result is exactly as shiny as it sounds. Wallpaper, meanwhile, glows a fashionable green, courtesy of arsenic, which the walls consider a decorative friend. Everyone eats, everyone coughs. The day is underway. Stepping outside is like entering a conversation already halfway through. The city has been speaking all night. Overcrowded alleys unspool into one another as if the mapmaker were paid by the bend. Seven Dials presents itself like a star drawn by a child who adored angles. Rookeries set their chairs directly onto the street. Laundry performs its slow theology from sill to sill. Costermongers propel their barrows with an optimism that makes space where there is none. They sing their goods because that is how onions, oranges, shrimps, and watercress prefer to be introduced. A micro hook for you, a hot spice potato. Vendor keeps his potatoes closer than friends, wrapped in warm flannel like infants, and the salt jar is communal. A tiny democracy on a stall. Pickpockets are gentlemen of choreography. In the crowd, a light touch steals a watch while the mouth returns the time with apologies. Slang is a full vocabulary. A fogle hunter likes your handkerchief. A drag shop receives stolen goods, and the swell mobsman dresses better than you. The new police, blue-coated and measured, prefer statistics to swordplay. Their thunderer whistles pierce the fog with a sound like a small steel gull. A bullseye lantern paints a circle of day wherever it looks. But mostly the streets are busy in the old ways. A crossing sweeper presides over a dry island the size of a doormat and rakes mud aside with authority. For a penny, he will convert your shoes into something the indoors will recognize. Horses contribute what horses contribute. By some estimates, thousands of tons per week. Mud learns languages. On wet days, it speaks everything at once. The Thames is a seasoned professional. Once, in the summer of 1858, the Great Stink it approached. Parliament with an argument so persuasive that Joseph the Zoljet was given money to teach the river manners. He did, by building intercepting sewers grander than you expect in a subject. Like this. Now the river is merely moody. Mudlarks still patrol the banks at low tide. Students of the coin that slipped, the nail that waited, the rope that remembered. Pier finders collect dog dung for the tanners, which proves that in London, nothing is truly useless. It is all simply waiting to be promoted. Dustmen rattle past with ash that will become bricks. Rag and bone men ring their cry for old iron. If you want to understand the city's metabolism, follow its rubbish the way a naturalist follows it. River upstream. By midday, the factories have caught their stride. Textile rooms hum a woolen thunder. Cotton fluff turns sunlight into an indoor snow that does not melt and is not entirely friendly to lungs. Children sweep beneath the looms with enviable agility, illegal in the strong sense, but necessity works long hours. In match factories, white phosphorus has ideas about modernity and about bones. Fussy jaw is the cheerful nickname of an ailment that is not cheerful. The match girls will strike in 1888 with crisp dignity and better results than many expected. Printers set arguments letter by lead letter, sentences heavy enough to lift with two hands. Foundries exhale sparks in disciplined fountains. A micro hook here. The man who oils the machine is as perfumed as any duchess, only with a fragrance sold by the gallon. The sweating system runs from garret to cellar like thread. Piecework migrates to wherever rent is cheapest and daylight is. Brave. Shirts are made in rooms that understand exactly what a shilling can do and what it cannot. A seamstress irons by the coal she can spare and stitches by the candle that keeps its own counsel. In the next house, a boot closer turns uppers into promises. On the corner, a cabinet maker builds a desk at which no one in his family will sit. London has this talent. It manufactures objects to be owned by people who will never meet the hands that built them. The workhouse waits like a stern ant. The poor law promises relief with a contract written in discomfort. Doors are separate. Men here, women there, children in their own mysterious geography. Families are reassembled by administrative logic. Meals are warm, regular, and narrow. Oakum picking teasing old rope into fibers for new tar turns time into small piles. The casual ward allows an overnight stay for the price of breaking. Stones are chopping wood tomorrow. A treadmill, solemn and precise, offers improvement in the form of stationary altitude. One reformer complains that too much kindness will ruin the poor. Another replies with a list of the poor who have already been ruined by something else. Magistrates make their decisions in rooms, with polished wood and a fondness for lists, fines for drunkenness, a week for disorderly behavior, 6 months for theft of a coat that wouldn't have fit anyway. Transportation to Australia is mostly concluded, replaced by a domestic enthusiasm for prison design. Pentonville experiments with a separate system where silence becomes a language. The last public hanging took its bow in 1868. Execution now occurs indoors with the discretion of a piano moved to the back room. Corporal punishment enjoys a busy calendar elsewhere. Schools and reformatories fence with canes in the name of improvement. In the evening, the newspapers will reconcile. All this into columns that make even chaos appear editorial. Dusk arrives like a barber with a soft cloth. Gas lamps pop into life, little sons who know their place. Shop windows perform, and the street watches. Music halls cultivate their reliable ecstasies, comic singers who promise a chorus you already know, tumblers who instruct gravity to take a short holiday, luminous ladies who can make a fan deliver an entire monologue. The audience participates because London believes in shared responsibility when it comes to tunes. Penny gaffes educate the youthful in approved and unapproved ways. Theaters manage death beautifully on stage and then go home to tea. Gin palaces blaze like aquariums of light. Mirrors make more of everything, including you. Brass rails are so clean that they've forgotten other colors exist. Because of licensing laws, the humble bit of cheese becomes a co-star, proof that your drink is in good company. A potman moves the pewter with a pianist's rhythm. Temperance meetings pass the door like a thoughtful cloud, offering lemonade, in which the bubbles are moral. Beer gardens host negotiations between clerks and bricklayers who discover, to their shared surprise, that hops are the true universal language. A micro hook arrives disguised as etiquette in some houses. Short beer is safer than water for the children and makes bedtime gentle in a way no lullaby can match Dot in certain neighborhoods. Whitechapel has a talent for headlines. The underworld conducts its chores. Brothels range from carpeted discretion to rooms that think curtains are a luxury. The Contagious Diseases Acts had tried to regulate bodies. Repeal will argue that people are not reservoirs to be fenced. Rescue. Homes write stern pamphlets. The women conduct their own arithmetic in the columns of risk, rent, and bread. Police patrol with bullseye lanterns that lay perfect circles on imperfect pavements. Most of what the light finds is ordinary. A drunk reconciling with a curb, a choral that fades from soprano to contralto, a cat who has seen it all and will see it again. And yes, for a few hateful months in the late 1880s, a killer taught the newspapers new shapes for the word fear, yet even then, most nights are a quiet set of errands. Rumor walks further than danger, which is, in its way, a kindness. Disease keeps late hours. Tuberculosis composes a long cough and signs it elegantly. Typhus consults every overcrowded lodging house as if reading a favorite novel. Sanitary reformers plot mortality on maps tinted in creams, rose, and green, as if death were a fashion plate. Doctors who once doubted now talk about germs with missionary certainty. Carbolic soap becomes a household celebrity. Hospitals grow until their staircases deserve names. Midwives know everyone and everything. Their ledgers are the city's other. Census. When smallpox mutters, a vaccination mark on the upper arm is a small round passport. Night workers give the city its hush. Printers' devils scurry through rooms where ink performs philosophy. At Billingsgate, the fish arrive with faces that know more than they say. Porters carry their intelligence in wicker. Covent Garden shrugs into flower-scented laughter while the moon is still clocking out. Postmen tie bundles with string whose knots could be taught in schools. Lodging house keepers let down the rope beds at dawn, and a dozen snorers glide politely to the floor, surprised but not offended. Chimney pots exchange small talk. Windows think declarative thoughts about washing. The last omnibus rattles by like a tin suitcase full of yawns. Morning rehearses again. The fog returns to its desk. A housemaid stretches a blacking brush along, the curve of a boot until the boot is a mirror pretending to be leather. Somewhere, a man shaves by touch because the glass is busy with condensation. Somewhere else, a pair of gloves is dried over the hearth and becomes the stiffest pair of hands in London. The knocker-up resumes his gentle percussion, a human woodpecker with a roster. He knows who tips in coins and who tips in thanks, and he keeps both lists carefully in his head. If you are still listening, you are doing precisely what Londoners do. Continuing. Perhaps you imagine you wouldn't last a day here. That is reasonable. The air asks questions. The water prefers anecdotes. Streets negotiate with your boots. Work likes to be counted in hours that do not end. The night offers amusements and footnotes. But people did last, in the practical tense, by boiling what could be boiled, by trusting a crossing sweeper, by voting with a mug of tea, by learning to read the river the way sailors read the sky, by striking when jawbones lit painfully from the inside, by saving pennies in a teapot with a lid that weighed as much as hope. And if your eyes are closing, that is also reasonable. London belongs to the sleeper as much as to the walker. Close them then. The chimneys will continue their quiet correspondence. The sewers will continue their magnificent commute. The bells will count the quarter hours like a librarian turning pages. Markets will bargain with the weather. And your place will be kept at the coffee stall, a tin mug waiting, steam rehearsing, until you wander back through the fog that tastes faintly and always of an enormous city waking up again.